I knew something was wrong the moment the phone rang at 1 in the morning. A trembling whisper warned me not to let anyone inside, and before I could even breathe, the knocking began, slow at first, then violent, as if the darkness outside wanted to break its way into my life. That single moment split everything open. Fear sank into my bones, and the world I thought I understood unraveled in seconds. What followed was not just a night of terror, but a journey that forced me to confront betrayal, buried truths, and a strength I never knew I had. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I was 68 years old the year everything changed. I had lived most of my life in Harborview, a small coastal town in Maine where the wind always smelled faintly of salt and pine. I used to think the quiet here was a blessing. It wrapped itself around me like a worn quilt, a sense of steadiness I clung to when my husband passed and the house felt too large for one person. I told myself the silence meant peace, though sometimes it was simply the only companion left. My home sat near the curve of the bay, a narrow wooden house painted soft blue, chipped at the edges. I kept a garden out front, mostly hydrangeas and marigolds, though the soil refused to cooperate some years. Inside, every room held something I had made with my hands: embroidered curtains, stitched table runners, wreaths of driftwood I sold at the weekend market. The small table by the window held the framed photograph of my husband, his smile frozen in the soft sunlight of a summer long gone. I still touched the corner of that frame each morning, as if it steadied me before the day began. I earned what I could from my crafts, adding it to my monthly Social Security income. It was never much, but I learned to make it enough. I kept a ledger book beside my sewing machine, with every expense written carefully in blue ink. I suppose that is what happens when you age alone. You cling to order, to the numbers you can control, because so many other things slip from your grasp. Still, I managed. Age did not take my hands or my patience, and both had value in their own quiet way. My son Michael lived 2 towns over. He was 38, restless and always running after something he could never quite hold. There was a time when he depended on me for everything. Then, a time when he acted as though he wished to forget I existed. I loved him, of course, because that is what mothers do. But loving him often felt like holding my breath. Some days he called, many days he did not. I had learned not to expect too much. I did not feel the same way about my neighbor, Ruth Alvarez. She was 71, sharp-eyed, and more alert than anyone her age had the right to be. She lived alone as well, and we often shared evening tea or walked together by the harbor. Ruth noticed things others overlooked. She had the kind of instinct shaped by hardship, the kind that made you trust her even when she offered warnings without explanations. My days passed in the rhythm of small, predictable things. A morning walk by the water, afternoon hours bent over my sewing table, evenings spent listening to gulls call over the bay while the sky turned orange, then purple, then deep blue. Some people might have found it lonely. I found it orderly, and order kept fear at bay. Still, as autumn settled over Harborview that year, I sensed something shifting. It was nothing obvious at first. A car driving slowly past the house more than once, a faint rustle near the garden late at night, a feeling, like the air holding its breath. I brushed it aside, but it lingered, subtle yet steady, like the first ripple before a storm reaches shore. I remember standing on my porch one evening, watching the sun sink behind the harbor, thinking that the stillness felt too still. I did not know it yet, but that quiet was about to break in a way that would unravel everything I thought I understood about my life, my home, and the people I trusted most. If you're still watching and this moment grabbed your attention, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Now hold on tight. Chapter 2 is where things start to shift. I woke to the sharp ring of the telephone cutting straight through the stillness of my bedroom. For a moment, I did not understand where I was, my mind still fogged with sleep, until the sound echoed again in the dark. The clock beside my bed glowed with the pale numbers 100. No one called at that hour unless something was terribly wrong. My heart stumbled once, then began to pound hard enough that I felt it in my throat. When I lifted the receiver, all I heard at first was fast, uneven breathing. Then Ruth's voice came through, low and strained in a way I had never heard from her. She whispered that I must not open the door for anyone. She repeated it, barely audible, as though she feared someone might hear her. Before I could ask a full question, she insisted again, her voice thready with urgency. The line fell silent for a moment. Then she hung up, leaving my hand trembling against the receiver. I sat still for a long second, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The air felt colder than before, and the shadows seemed heavier as I stepped into the hallway. Something in Ruth's tone had pierced straight into me. I did not know what she had seen, but I trusted that she would never startle me without cause. When I reached the top of the stairs, the first knock came. It was not gentle. It was deliberate, firm, and far too loud for the hour. Each strike against the wood echoed through my ribs. I froze at the midpoint of the steps, staring toward the front door as though it might move of its own accord. Another knock followed, then another, spaced like a rhythm only the intruders understood. The house felt smaller with every blow, shrinking inward as the air thickened around me. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I crept down the final steps until I could see the faint outline of 2 figures through the frosted glass. They stood close together, both wearing heavy jackets and pulled-down caps that hid most of their faces. One held a stack of papers. The other scanned the yard in quick, sweeping motions. They claimed they had legal documents for the occupant, but their voices carried no professionalism, only impatience. My pulse thudded harder. Something about them was wrong. They did not behave like any official I had ever encountered. Their stance was aggressive, their tone was clipped, and the hour itself made their presence unsettling. I backed away slowly, careful not to let the floorboards creak under my weight. The phone rang again. Ruth told me she had seen the same men wandering the neighborhood earlier, moving from one property to another without knocking. She urged me to stay silent and keep everything locked. She promised she would call the authorities if they lingered much longer. Her voice shook with genuine fear. The knocking continued for several minutes before it stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I waited in absolute stillness, listening for footsteps, for whispers, for anything that suggested they were still nearby. Eventually, the sound of tires rolling over gravel drifted through the window. Only then did I breathe again. When I finally approached the door, a single sheet of paper lay on the floor just inside the threshold. I picked it up with hesitant fingers. It resembled an eviction notice, stamped with a bold ink, but the name printed on it was not mine. It read, Michael Carter. My confusion deepened into something darker, something cold that settled beneath my ribs. The night outside the window looked too black, too silent, as though someone might still be watching from the shadows. If you're still watching and can feel the tension building, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following along. What happens next in Chapter 3 will change everything. I stood in the center of my dim living room, with the paper clenched between my fingers, feeling its weight far more than its actual ounces. The name printed across the top, Michael Carter, did not belong to me, nor to anyone I had ever known. Yet someone had placed it at my door at 1 a.m, as if it were meant to provoke, to warn, or to intimidate. The silence in the house pressed in on me, and for a moment it felt as though the walls themselves were listening, waiting for my next breath, my next step, my next mistake. I reread the unfamiliar name again, letting its strangeness sink in, letting it anchor the unease that had been circling me ever since the knocking began. The fear that crawled beneath my ribs stirred another memory, one I had tried to brush aside when Emily first told me. She had mentioned a man lingering near her apartment complex, hovering in the parking lot long after sunset, always pretending to scroll through his phone. She said he claimed to be from a financial services firm, but his visits never followed any business hours. At the time, I thought it was only another of the uneasy stories that float around college neighborhoods. Now, with a stranger's paperwork on my porch in the dead of night, the threads began to connect in ways I did not want them to. I walked back to the front door, checking the lock with the slow, deliberate movements. The deadbolt felt slightly looser than usual. The paint around the handle carried fresh scratches, tiny but unmistakable under the hallway light. On the welcome mat lay the faint marks that looked like the outline of heavy-soled shoes. The realization that they had tried the handle sent a prickling sensation across my shoulders, as if unseen eyes were still tracking me from somewhere beyond the walls. With the lamps turned off, the house fell into a soft, watchful darkness. I moved to the window and eased the curtain open just enough to see the yard. The street lamp cast long shadows across the driveway, stretching them thin and distorted. The stillness outside felt unnatural, as though the world had paused mid-breath. The trees swayed only slightly, and every shift of their branches sounded sharper, more deliberate, like footsteps trying to disguise themselves as wind. When the phone buzzed in my pocket, I nearly dropped the curtain. It was Ruth again. Her voice was quieter this time, strained by something that hovered between fear and guilt. She admitted she had thrown away a similar paper earlier that week, also left at her door without explanation. Then she confessed something else, something heavier. Earlier that afternoon, men had knocked on her door with forceful insistence, asking intrusive questions about property records. When she refused to open, they became aggressive. It was the first twist of the night, the kind that confirmed everything inside me had reason to tighten. After the call ended, I stared at the paper again, trying to imagine the face of the man it belonged to. The pattern was becoming clear: impersonation, intimidation, pressure. Not an honest debt collector, but someone who thrived on coercion. I had read of such groups, ones who operated just outside the law, but I never imagined my quiet street would catch their interest. I tried calling Emily, but her voicemail picked up immediately. Hearing her recorded greeting made my pulse jump with new urgency, as though the silence on her end was its own kind of warning. I left a message steady enough to hide the tremor in my voice, but the worry remained lodged in my chest long after I hung up. Another sound drifted across the yard, a soft grind of gravel, too deliberate to be the wind. I held my breath and listened, waiting for certainty. It came in the form of a second shift of pebbles, closer this time. My heartbeat thumped loudly in my ears, and I forced myself to remain still, to observe rather than react. Moments like this always dragged up fragments of older wounds. I thought of the day Emily convinced me to sign documents I barely had time to read, papers that later stripped me of rights to part of my own property. The sting of that betrayal resurfaced now, sharpening my sense of danger. Once, I trusted too easily. I would not repeat that mistake with strangers who arrived under cover of darkness. At last, I placed the paper inside a locked drawer in the hallway cabinet, telling myself it might matter later. Evidence, if that was what this night was turning into. I did not know who Michael Carter was, or why his name had landed here, but I knew the danger had not passed. The knocking, the whispers through the phone, the silence that followed them, all of it felt like the beginning of something larger creeping toward my door. If you're still here and the unfolding mystery has you hooked, comment number 3 below so I know you're right beside me. Chapter 4 is about to reveal a shocking turn. Morning arrived without bringing comfort. I woke in a fog of exhaustion, as though the night had pressed its weight directly into my bones. The house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes sound seem louder than it is. Each step across the floorboards reminded me how little rest I had gotten. My mind replayed the scrape of gravel, the foreign name on the paper, and the uneasy silence stretching outside my window. Even in daylight, the unease did not lift. It only shifted shape, becoming something sharper and more intrusive. I began the day by walking through every room, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed. Yet everything felt slightly out of place. The living room curtains were tugged off their usual line, as if someone had brushed them. A faint trail of dirt marked the side of the foyer rug. Outside, along the edge of the porch, the outline of shoe prints remained, muddled but visible. The sunlight illuminated each sign more clearly than the lamplight had, confirming this was not a dream or a trick of my imagination. Something happened here, and it happened close. With a slow breath, I sat at my computer and typed the name Michael Carter. What appeared on the screen only deepened the uncertainty. There were dozens of entries. Several were tied to legal disputes, some indicated unpaid debts, and others mentioned complaints about stolen identities. None of them seemed to point toward one identifiable person. The ambiguity made it worse. It meant the man on the paper could be anyone, or no one at all. It could be a fabricated name used to manipulate homeowners. The more I scrolled, the more I felt the quiet throb of suspicion pulsing behind my ribs. I reached for the phone and called the local police station. The officer who answered listened politely before giving the measured response I had feared. They could not send anyone out unless there was a direct threat, and a piece of paper at my door did not qualify. I hung up with a hollow feeling spreading through my stomach. Being told to call back if it happens again felt like an invitation for the situation to escalate. Stepping outside to retrieve the mail, I found something else that froze me in place. The side gate, which I always kept latched, hung open by a few inches. The metal latch swung lightly in the breeze, clicking softly against the wood. I had not touched that gate in over a week. Someone had gone around the side of the house under the cover of night. The realization tightened my throat. This was no misunderstanding. Someone was searching, probing, testing. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the chill of the realization settle into me. My first instinct was to call Ruth, but I hesitated. If she was dealing with the same people who had approached me, I did not want to draw more attention to either of us. Instead, I tried calling Emily again, hoping her voice would steady me. The call rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I left a message, choosing my words carefully to avoid sounding frightened. Still, the silence that followed was heavier than before. Back inside, I moved from window to window, checking latches and frames. I added makeshift measures of security, wooden rods in the tracks of the sliding door, small objects balanced near points of entry so they would fall loudly if disturbed. Each precaution steadied me slightly, giving me a sense of action, even if minor. While organizing my desk, I came across an old document Emily once urged me to sign. It was the same type of document that later enabled her to claim rights to my property. The memory rushed back with an uncomfortable clarity. That betrayal was a wound that had never truly closed. Seeing the paperwork now reminded me how easily trust could be twisted, how quickly something precious could be taken. I took a blank notebook from the drawer, opened to the first page, and began writing. I listed the time the knocking started, the exact wording Ruth had used when she called, the paper on the porch, the shoe prints, the open gate. Recording it all grounded me. It gave shape to the confusion. Even as I wrote, I sensed that this was only the beginning. Everything in me whispered that the real danger had not yet revealed itself, and these first efforts, however careful, were only preparation for something larger drawing nearer. If you're still watching, and these twists are keeping you curious, comment number 4 below to let me know you're staying with the story. Chapter 5 will push everything to the edge. The afternoon settled over the house in an unnatural quiet, a quiet so complete it felt arranged rather than accidental. Even the faint hum of the neighbor's air conditioning unit, normally a constant background note, had gone silent. As I moved through the living room, I felt the weight of that stillness pressing against the windows, as though the world outside had paused to watch what would happen next. Something in the air hinted at a shift, a tension tightening by the minute. I pulled the curtain a fraction to look toward the street. That was when I saw it, a dark-colored car idling at the very end of my driveway, angled slightly toward the house. The windows were tinted heavily enough that nothing inside was visible. It had no front license plate, just a blank metal frame. The vehicle did not belong to any neighbor, and no one in our quiet community drove something so deliberately obscured. It did not need to move for me to feel its intrusion. A moment later, a man stepped out from behind the car as though he had been waiting for the right time to reveal himself. He stood completely still, facing my home with a posture that carried intention. He wore a dark jacket, a cap pulled low, and kept his hands in his pockets. Even from a distance, I sensed he was not observing the neighborhood, he was observing me. The realization that I had become an object of focus tightened something deep inside my chest. I let the curtain fall back into place, but before I could take 2 steps away, a sound came from the backyard. A sharp crack, the distinct noise of a branch giving way under weight. I froze, listening. Another sound followed, gravel shifting lightly under feet. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was moving quietly, with control, attempting not to be heard. The fear that rose inside me was clean and cold. I walked quickly through the house, turning off every light, until the interior sank into a muted darkness. The silence grew heavier, enveloping everything. From the kitchen, I heard the soft metallic sound of a door handle being tested. Someone was trying the back door with cautious, measured pressure, as though assessing how much force would be needed. Then came the first strike, a sudden thud against the back door that made the frame shudder. I pressed my hand against the nearest counter, trying to steady my breathing. The second blow followed, stronger than the first. Whoever was out there had shed their earlier restraint. They wanted inside. The footsteps moved next toward the side of the house. Slow, deliberate steps that mapped the layout, seeking another point of entry. I stepped deeper into the shadows, avoiding every patch of light. The intruders were not guessing. They were methodically testing the vulnerability of the structure, as though this house had been studied beforehand. Then a sound slid through the front entryway, paper scraping softly against wood. I inched forward until I could see the edge of an envelope sticking through the doorframe. I waited until the footsteps moved away before reaching down to retrieve it. The envelope was plain, except for a single name printed on top, the same name as before, followed by a handwritten line added in uneven strokes. It read, "We know you have information." My pulse thudded unevenly as I examined the corner of the page. There, faint but unmistakable, was the seal of a financial office, a name I recognized. Emily had mentioned that office years ago when she brought me documents to sign. The memory of those papers, the ones that handed her partial control over my assets, returned with a painful clarity. The line between her decisions and the threat now stalking my house felt suddenly dangerously close. Before I could think further, 3 heavy knocks shook the front door. Not hurried, not panicked, slow, commanding knocks that demanded attention. The quiet that followed was thick enough to make the room vibrate. Then a voice, low and close to the other side of the wood, slipped into the silence. It was not loud, but it carried unmistakable intent. "We know you are listening." I stood entirely still, barely allowing myself to breathe. The voice lingered in the air long after the steps retreated, and the dark car rolled silently away, leaving behind a house filled with shadows and the certainty that the first confrontation had only just begun. The house felt strangely hollow after the men disappeared, as though their presence had left an imprint on the air itself. I stood in the middle of the living room, aware of the faint echo of my own breathing. My heartbeat had not yet returned to its natural rhythm. The walls no longer felt like protection. They felt like skin stretched too thin over a rising threat. Darkness still pressed against the windows, even though night had not yet arrived. I sensed the danger had not passed. It had only stepped back long enough to gather strength. What unsettled me even more than the men was the silence from Emily. A full day had passed without so much as a message. My earlier irritation at her absence had shifted into something heavier, a fear I did not want to acknowledge. I remembered her voice months ago when she insisted I sign financial documents she barely explained. I remembered the way her eyes avoided mine when I asked questions. The memory returned like a warning I had failed to interpret in time. I moved to the hallway cabinet and pulled out the file box that held those old papers. The cardboard felt soft from age, but I handled each page carefully as I laid them out across the table. The same office seal appeared again and again, the identical seal that had marked the paper shoved under my door last night. The connection between the two events, a past wound and the present danger, became undeniable. It felt like seeing a crack in the foundation of my life that had been hidden beneath the paint for years. As I stared at the papers, a mix of emotions rose through me. Anger at being taken advantage of, disappointment in the daughter I had trusted, shame for not asking more questions sooner. Yet beneath all of that, the instinct to protect her stirred in me with surprising force. I hated that these two impulses could exist at the same time. I hated that I could feel both betrayed and compelled to help. I considered calling the police again, but I stopped myself. The men who came last night had not been careless. They had left no real evidence, only fear. Even the message on the second envelope would be dismissed as a vague threat. I imagined trying to explain the situation to a tired officer behind a desk, and saw clearly how futile it would be. Leaving town crossed my mind next, packing a few essentials, driving west until I reached somewhere anonymous. But I knew deep down that fleeing would not solve anything. If those men believed I owed them something, running would only embolden them, and leaving might also close the last remaining door between me and Emily. I could not do that. Not while she might be tangled in something even worse than I understood. When I stepped outside to double-check the locks, my foot brushed against something on the front step. A small, inexpensive phone rested against the stone, its screen glowing faintly. My name was not on it, but the implication was clear. The device buzzed once, and a message flashed across the screen with stark simplicity. Emily owes what she cannot pay. You will answer instead. A chill moved through me. They knew her name. They knew she was connected to me. They believed I was the one who would cover whatever debt she had fallen into. The realization struck me with the clarity of cold water. This was not random intimidation. This was targeted, calculated, personal. I held the phone in both hands, feeling its unnatural weight. My choices narrowed until they lay before me with painful clarity. I could lock every door, shut every curtain, and hope they chose to abandon their pursuit. Or I could step forward, pull at the threads of the truth Emily had hidden, and face whatever waited at the end of them. The fear inside me did not disappear, but it shifted into something steadier, something resolute. In the dim light of the hallway, I tightened my grip around the phone and understood what I had already decided. I would not abandon my daughter. Not again. Not like this. If you're still here and feeling the weight of what just unfolded, comment number 6 below so I know you're with me. Now, let's move into Chapter 7, where the fallout begins. Morning arrived with a pale light that struggled to enter the house, as if even the sun hesitated to cross the threshold. I had not slept at all. I moved from room to room throughout the night, listening for sounds that never came, waiting for the men to return. When the quiet finally settled, it did not bring relief. It brought a deeper kind of unease, the kind that follows once danger steps back just far enough to make you realize how exposed you truly are. My limbs felt heavy, my eyes ached, and every breath carried a tremor of exhaustion. I began inspecting the house methodically, needing to understand what had happened while the fear was still fresh. The back door bore faint smudges where hands had pressed against it, testing its strength. Beneath the handle, a thin trail of dirt suggested someone had leaned in closer than I wanted to imagine. The side fence looked worse than before. One hinge sagged at an angle, almost torn free from the wood. It did not happen by accident. The pressure had been deliberate, forceful, and determined. They were not simply sending warnings. They were pushing boundaries, step by step. Each small discovery tightened the anxiety that already lived beneath my ribs. Even mundane sounds startled me. The wind tapping against the kitchen vent felt like fingers brushing metal. The brittle scrape of dry leaves across the siding made my heart lurch. I felt as though the house had become transparent, as though its walls could no longer hide me. Every ordinary noise carried an echo of threat. It was the first time I truly understood how quickly safety can dissolve. The phone they left sat on my dining table, its black screen reflecting the thin morning light. I dreaded touching it, yet my eyes kept returning to it. One message, one line. Emily owes what she cannot pay. You will answer instead. The cruelty of it lay in its simplicity. It did not offer explanation, only demand. Seeing my daughter's name tied to something so sinister forced a knot into my throat. I kept imagining Emily as a child, clutching my sleeve when storms rolled over our old neighborhood. That image clashed violently with the reality in front of me. I tried calling her again. My hands trembled as I dialed. The call went to voicemail as quickly as before. Another attempt, another silence. The uncertainty gnawed at me, pulling me between anger and fear. I did not know whether to blame her or mourn for her. I only knew that she was missing, unreachable, and possibly in danger far beyond her control. Later in the morning, while I stood on the porch trying to compose myself, one of my neighbors walked by. She paused, hesitated, and then admitted she heard a vehicle running late in the night, near 3 o'clock. She had been too frightened to look out the window. Her reluctance and her fear formed a new kind of isolation around me. Whatever was unfolding had begun to ripple through the neighborhood, but no one was willing to stand with me. I did not resent them. I understood. Fear urges people to retreat, not intervene. When I returned to the mailbox, another sign waited for me. A single sheet of paper, taped loosely to the metal. No words, only a thick black circle drawn in the center. It had no meaning I could decipher, and perhaps that was the point. It was meant to unsettle. It worked. The crude shape felt more ominous than written threats. It was a symbol of watching, of patience, of inevitability. I stepped back into the house and lowered myself into a chair. My hands would not stay still. Everything inside me churned. I understood now that the previous night had not been a standalone moment. It was only the opening act. The aftermath was not a fading echo. It was a widening path I had no choice but to walk. And despite the fear, one truth anchored me. I had to continue. For Emily's sake. For my own survival. For the truth that refused to stay buried. I woke with a heaviness that clung to my chest, as if the long night had seeped into my bones. The exhaustion was undeniable, but so was the quiet insistence that I had run out of room to hide. Avoiding the situation had only tightened the noose around me. I sat at the kitchen table, the early light sliding through the blinds into thin, sharp stripes. In front of me lay every scrap of evidence collected over the past days. The strange phone, the messages slipped under the door, the black circle from the mailbox, and the thick stack of documents Emily had once begged me to sign. For a moment, I simply stared, overwhelmed by how ordinary they looked spread across the laminate table. Yet every item carried a weight I could not ignore. I took a deep breath and opened the notebook that had become my refuge. I wrote down everything I remembered, placing times, dates, descriptions, and small details that had seemed insignificant at first. Placing them on paper helped me feel as if I had regained even a fraction of control. When I turned to the documents Emily had rushed me through years earlier, I studied them in a way I had not done at the time. I traced the printed names, the repeated logos, the string of matching signatures she had scribbled in a hurry. All of it connected to the same financial office that now appeared on the envelopes delivered by strangers. That realization tightened something inside me. Emily had not stumbled into trouble by accident. Someone had led her there. I called Ruth, my voice low, as I recounted what I found. She listened quietly, then urged me to come by, insisting she had seen a strange vehicle circling the block over the last week. Her concern was enough to stiffen my resolve. We sat together for a long time, piecing through possibilities, both of us sensing that whatever threatened me had long arms and a clear purpose. Back home, I sat before my old computer and logged into Emily's bank account. The screen loaded slowly, the way it always had, as if it held its breath before revealing the truth. Dozens of small withdrawals appeared, followed by a larger transfer to a company whose name echoed the one printed faintly on the documents on my table. The connection was undeniable. My fear did not fade, but something else rose to stand beside it: determination. I closed the laptop, walked to the window, and looked out over the quiet street. The world outside had not changed, but I had. For the first time since Emily vanished, I felt myself stepping toward answers rather than running from shadows. If you're still watching and ready to uncover the truth that has been building from the start, comment number 8 below. Let's move into the final chapters and see how everything comes together. The day felt strangely muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When I stepped back into my house, the quiet pressed against me in a way that was no longer threatening but hollow, like the aftermath of a long storm. I set my coat on the hook by the door and stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. It was the first time in days that the floor under my feet did not feel like it was shifting. On the table lay the same stack of documents, the strange phone, and the notebook where I had written every detail. Now, though, they no longer carried the same weight. The sheriff had taken copies of everything, and for once, I felt the burden pass from my shoulders to someone equipped to handle it. His promise of protection had not erased the fear completely, but it offered something I had not felt in a long while: breathing room. When the call came telling me they had found Emily, something inside me that tightened and then slowly unwound. She had been hiding at a roadside motel, exhausted and frightened, unable to outrun the trouble she had helped create. Seeing her again felt like facing a stranger wrapped in the memories of my daughter. Her eyes were red, her hands shook, and the apology in her expression was deeper than anything words could have offered. I stayed beside her as she agreed to cooperate with the investigation, though both of us knew this did not erase the damage left behind. Later, when the police confirmed that several members of the group threatening me had been arrested, I felt a thin thread of air enter my lungs. Not victory, not triumph, but release. They assured me my name was cleared from every file, every false signature, every debt that had never been mine. The danger was not completely gone, but the shadow that once hovered at my window had begun to fade. That evening, I stepped onto the porch. The street was quiet again, touched by the soft gold of dusk. For the first time in what felt like ages, I stood without expecting footsteps behind me. The world looked ordinary, almost gentle. It was not the ending I once hoped for, but it was the one I had earned. I had survived the fear, the betrayal, and the long night of not knowing. Whatever came next, I would meet it standing. The morning light settled gently across my porch, soft and cool, carrying the scent of damp grass. I sat on the top step with a calm I had not felt in a very long time. The air was still, almost fragile, as if the world itself was allowing me a quiet moment and after everything that had unfolded. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders rested without tension. My breath moved easily in and out, steady and unhurried. As I watched the sun stretch across the street, I thought about the path that had brought me here. The frantic phone call at 1 a.m, the knocks that shattered the silence, the shadows that moved just beyond the window, the chilling knowledge that my own daughter had unknowingly tied me to people who lived by fear and intimidation. Yet somewhere within all of that darkness, I had found a strength I never expected. I had uncovered a voice inside myself that refused to be pushed into silence. Age had not weakened me. It had shaped me. It had carved out a steadiness, a resilience that had carried me through the longest nights. What I faced did not harden me, but it did teach me to protect the parts of myself that mattered. Love, even love for a child, could not erase the necessity of boundaries. Emily would have to find her own way now. I did not close the door to her, but I no longer held it open at my own expense. Healing, if it came, would be earned. Trust, if it returned, would be rebuilt slowly, one truthful step at a time. When I finally rose and stepped inside, the house felt different. Not haunted, not fragile, but grounded. Safe, because I had reclaimed it. I moved through the rooms with a sense of ownership I had not felt in years. As I closed the door behind me, a simple truth settled into place. Fear may come in the night, but so can courage. And courage, once awakened, does not easily fade. There are moments in life when the world grows unbearably quiet, and in that stillness, we finally see what fear has tried to hide. Out of darkness, we discover that strength is not something we find suddenly, but something we have been carrying all along. Survival becomes more than endurance. It becomes clarity. We then learn that boundaries protect us not from love, but from losing ourselves. And even when trust is shaken, even when the night feels endless, the human spirit has an instinct to rise, to rebuild, and to reclaim a sense of peace. Every ending leaves a quiet echo, a reminder that resilience is not loud or dramatic. It is simply the decision to keep moving forward with open eyes and a steadier heart. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments, and remember to like, follow, and subscribe for more.